Special thanks for making the effort to get here, because as I always say, my day job is very good, but it's all about delivery. And you people have managed to get here. Some might have had the confusion of the journey, but very pleased that we'll go with the numbers we've got. I will say at the end, but today special thanks to Rod and Clyde for hosting it for us in these fantastic surroundings. This is sort of become a bit of an annual event, titled Building Compliance. I didn't really call it that for two reasons. First, about compliance in buildings, and as many of you know, the journey of actually building compliance, if you're managing particular buildings, building services, FM, or from the legal side. I'd just say another point, through my maturity and age, I'm a big fan of the balanced scorecard, and many of you remember that in the 90s, purely because you've got the dimensions of the customer, the financial, the organisational development, and of course internal business, which normally aligns to risk. And like the Institute of Risk Management, you have financial risk, operational risk, various aspects, and obviously health and safety is a key part of that. So I think bringing together, which I think the scorecard is a great balanced approach, together with risk management, and bring those two together, are really good tools for property owners, developers, managers, FMs, building service engineers, all those sort of people. So I think it really fits in well tonight. Again, we're going to have three very punchy presentations. Then after that, we can have a bit of a discussion and question and answer. And then we'll continue with Prudence questions and networking outside. So hopefully everybody's okay with that. Feel free in the question times and networking to ask all the questions you'd like. But first of all, so like I said before, thanks for Clyde for doing it, particularly Rod, because in the industry, we've worked with Rod a number of times on these events. A really great rounded approach to what some of the issues are, and certainly around the sentencing guidelines. So I'll hand you over to Rod. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, good evening everybody, and a very warm welcome to Clyde Co's offices. I'll start with the usual formality. There's no fire alarm expected this evening, so if it does go off, then we simply need to make our way back down to reception, and there'll be a fire marshal there who will escort us out of the building. By way of brief introduction, my name's Rod Hunt. I'm a partner in the Safety, Health and Environmental Regulatory Department at Clyde Co, and we specialise advising businesses and individuals who find themselves the subject of enforcement action by regulators. That might be by way of a criminal investigation or a criminal prosecution, but either way, it's all in the criminal arena. In terms of my presentation today, you've all got the packs on your chair. Inside of the packs, there are slides for all three presentations. In terms of my own presentation, I'm conscious of the time slot, so I will be skipping through a few of the slides, but all of the information is in there for you if you wish to refer to it at a later date. There's a copy of our brochure that gives you a bit more detail about who we are and what we do, and then there's also a pamphlet about our training offering. We've seen an increased interest from our clients in terms of training in relation to various aspects, typically running through from a criminal investigation through to criminal prosecutions and inquests. It may be that increased interest is on the back of the guidelines that we're going to have a look at today, but either way, there's a pamphlet in your packs that talks about the typical sort of training events that we can offer. There are the prices in there, they're per event. We don't charge per person, and typically we can cater for up to 30 people. So if you're interested in any of those courses, or you'd like to chat through what we might be able to offer, then please do either pop up after today's event, or please feel free to give me a call or send me an email during the course of the week. So what are we going to look at today? We're going to look at the new sentencing guidelines, why they've been brought into place, how they work, and how they're being applied by the courts in practice. In terms of why they've been brought in, they were issued on the 1st of February this year, And we think the reasons that they've been brought into force are primarily because there's a new Lord Chief Justice, and we think that the judiciary feel embarrassed by the tabloid headlines in terms of fines are too low, and equally that the judiciary feel embarrassed by the fact that the financial regulators are handing out multi-million-pound fines without having to go to the courts, where it doesn't involve any fatalities. You can see the sensitivity. It first appears in the consultation paper in relation to the guidelines, and if you look at the penultimate point on the slides in front of you, you'll see it says fines imposed on organisations for health and safety offences have in the past been criticised as too low relative to the harm caused, the culpability of the offender, and on occasions to the means of the offender. So there's the criticism point. It's probably worth just flagging that there were separate guidelines issued a couple of years ago for environmental offences. And in relation to those guidelines, turnover was the key determinant, and we're going to see in a moment how that's followed its way through to these new guidelines. So the new guidelines cover health and safety, corporate manslaughter, and food safety. And we're going to look at the health and safety and the corporate manslaughter today. There's about 10 to 11 steps as part of the sentencing process in the guidelines. You'll be pleased to hear I have no intention of running through each and every one of those steps, but I am going to flag 3 or 4 of the key points. The starting point for any court will be to determine the offence category, and that will involve looking at the culpability of the offender and the seriousness of the harm risked. And so here are the definitions here for culpability. I'm going to suggest that there's not going to be too many companies that are prosecuted in the criminal courts where their culpability is low. Equally, I doubt there's going to be too many cases where the offender fits into the very high culpability. That's a deliberate breach or a flagrant disregard for the law. That really is right at the very top end. I think most businesses that appear before the courts will have high culpability, and some will have medium. So high culpability is offender fell far short of the appropriate standard. For example, by failing to put in place measures that are recognised standards in the industry, ignoring concerns raised by employees or others, failing to make appropriate changes following prior incidents exposing risks to health and safety. That was a specific point that was commented on in the recent Alton Towers prosecution, and allowing breaches to subsist over a long period of time. And then the other point there is serious and or systemic failure. And then medium culpability is simply that the offender fell short, not far short. So that's culpability. The next thing that the courts will look at is the seriousness of harm risked, and then the likelihood of that harm occurring. So the seriousness of harm risk, we've got levels A, B and C. Right at the top end, level A, that won't surprise you to find death, and obviously the most serious types of physical impairment that are going to last for life. And then right at the end, we've got level C, which is helpfully defined as anything else that doesn't fall within A or B. The courts then look at the likelihood of that harm occurring, and that gives you a harm category. That point at the bottom of the slide is interesting and important. Once the courts have determined the harm category, they then have to go on and consider these other 2 factors. And that is, number 1, whether the offence exposed a number of workers or members of the public to the risk of harm. And number 2, whether the offence was a significant cause of the actual harm. And if it was, then the guidelines say that the courts can increase the harm category on the back of that. So I mentioned earlier that turnover is king in relation to these guidelines. The guidelines identify 4 types of company. There's large, medium, small and micro. Micro is less than 2 million, small is 2 to 10, medium's 10 to 50, and then large is 50 million and over. And you can imagine 50 million and over, that's a lot of companies that are going to fall within the large category. So once the courts determine the offence category, they go to the table that the company falls within by turnover, and then they look at the harm category, they look at the culpability, then they look at the harm category, and that gives a starting point and a range. So if we take high culpability harm category 1, we've got a starting point there of 2.4 million and a category range of 1.5 million up to 6 million. Equally, if we look a little further down, low culpability harm category 4, we've got a starting point of £10,000 and a category range of £3,000 to £60,000. So I called the turnover lottery. I'm not going to run through the slide with the medium-sized company, but it's the same concept. If that's the turnover lottery, then we've got the rollover draw here. There is a big caveat in the guidelines. It basically says that if you are a very large organisation where your turnover very greatly exceeds £50 million, then the courts can move outside of the thresholds to achieve the sentencing purpose of a proportionate sentence. As is often the case in the law, there's no definition of what a very large organisation is, but without doubt, if you're approaching £1 billion or exceeding that, you will definitely be a very large organisation. What sort of fines might get imposed if you are a very large organisation and the courts move outside of the bandings? Well, there's some guidance here, some sort of indication. It was a case in the Court of Appeal, it's Thames Water, and it was an environmental case, so not health and safety, but typically the court will treat health and safety cases where there's been a fatality as more serious than an environmental case. So hopefully that will put this quote into context. So it's the Court of Appeal saying that they've already outlined the approach by reference to the guideline, starting with turnover, but having regard to all the financial circumstances, including profitability. In such a case, the objectives of punishment, deterrence, and the removal of gain must be achieved by the level of penalty imposed. And here's the key point. This may well result in a fine equal to a substantial percentage, up to 100% of the company's pre-tax net profit for the year in question, even if this results in fines in excess of £100 million. Fines of such magnitude are imposed in the financial services market for breach of regulations. So there's the nod and the wink to the financial services point that I mentioned earlier. In terms of the types of offences that are going to attract this sort of penalty, it's businesses with a huge turnover, big profit margins, where the culpability is high and the harm that is caused is also very high. So it really will be reserved for the exceptional cases. There hasn't been a company of this sort of nature that's appeared before the courts yet. And it might be these sorts of fines aren't imposed for 2, 3, 4 years, whilst these guidelines start to bed in and the courts get used to handing out much bigger penalties. But don't be surprised in the future, big company, big profits, most serious offence, if these sorts of fines start to be imposed. So whose turnover counts? There's no real change there. It's the entity that's before the court, unless the guidelines say exceptionally it's demonstrated that the resources of a linked organisation are available. So if Clyde Co were in court, it would be our accounts that the court would typically look at, unless they were a holding company and there was very good reasons for piercing the corporate veil and going up to the hire company. Corporate manslaughter is a very similar approach, except that, I suppose, when we look at culpability and harm, somebody's died. They have to die for it to be, or they have to die for it to be a corporate manslaughter offence. So we've got the worst type of harm straight off. And one of the key elements of corporate manslaughter is there has to be a gross breach. So you've already got the most serious form of culpability. But what the guidelines do is try and split corporate manslaughter into 2 types of offences for sentencing purposes. And in terms of which category you fall within, A or B, it's these 4 factors here that the court will take into account. How foreseeable was serious injury? How far short of the appropriate standard did the offender fall? How common is this kind of breach in the organisation? And was there more than one death or a high risk of further deaths or serious personal injury in addition to death? If the answer to those questions put you in the higher culpability category, then you're going to be in category A. And so what does that mean? Well, here we've got it for a large organisation. Offence category A, starting point 7.5 million, category range 4.8 million up to 20 million. And you'll see at the top, in the box, this is lifted from the guidelines. We've got the caveat again for very large organisations. It's not just businesses that appear in the guidelines, individuals do as well. It's exactly the same approach, offence category, culpability, harm. You'll see culpability here, we've got deliberate, reckless, negligent and low, as opposed to very high, high, etc. And you can see there's a starting point in the category range. And even down in low culpability harm category 1, we've got custody as an option. Whether or not that plays out, we'll have to wait and see. In terms of the, if I just go back one, you can see in terms of fine levels, they've got reference to bandings here, A, B, C, D, E and F. Well, that's how they're calculated, that's set out in the guidelines. So band F, the starting point would be 600% of their weekly income, and then the category range is 500 to 700%. So those are that's an overview of why the guidelines have come in. That's a quick canter through the actual guidelines themselves. What I'd like to do is just spend 3 or 4 slides now looking through fines that are being imposed by the courts at the moment. And as we're running through these, I'd encourage you to bear in mind that prior to these guidelines coming into force, the previous guidelines said starting point for a fatality, where it's health and safety, is 100,000, and starting point for corporate manslaughter is 500,000. So what we've got here is health and safety fatalities in the Crown Court, very large businesses, there's 3 there, and the fines go from 2 up to 4 million. We can already see that's a huge increase on the 500,000 starting point under the previous guidelines. It's just dropped down to medium. There's a £1 million fine there for a fatality in the Crown Court. Here's health and safety in the Crown Court again, but non-fatal. Very large organisations, there's similar fine levels there to fatals. I suspect that is because the culpability is the same, and if I go back to the risk categorisation, it's seriousness of harm risked and the likelihood of that harm occurring, not just whether or not in fact the harm did eventuate. So Alton Towers there, £5 million, nobody died. So that's in the Crown Court. In the Magistrates Court, the maximum fine used to be for health and safety, £20,000 per offence. Here's one here, Magistrates Court for a fatality. Under the old regime, a fatality would never have got dealt with in the Magistrates Court. It has been dealt with here, a £1 million fine. Non-fatal in the Magistrates Court, we've got a range from 100,000 up to 500,000. Those are the sorts of fine levels that were imposed in the Crown Court previously. Interestingly, in terms of corporate manslaughter, the only 2 offences under the new guidelines, or at least convictions, we've got just over 500,000 for both of them. But really, that harks back to the problem that the prosecution have always had in relation to corporate manslaughter, and that's securing convictions against bigger organisations. So that probably isn't a true reflection. If there is a corporate manslaughter conviction for a big organisation, then the fine level will be much, much higher than that. So what does the future hold? Well, there's obviously changes in sentencing practices that are going to affect corporates and individuals. The staged approach should give much more clarity in terms of the sentencing process, particularly in terms of banding levels in relation to fines. The guidelines really are, I'm going to suggest, geared towards big organisations, large and very large, and they are the ones who are going to bear the brunt of these guidelines, and they are going to receive much bigger fines going forwards. In terms of whether or not there's more custodial sentences for the most serious offences, then we'll have to wait and see. Gross negligence manslaughter, which is covered by these guidelines, has always attracted custodial sentences, and really it's the exception rather than the rule as to whether or not somebody does get sent to prison for gross negligence manslaughter. It'll be interesting to see whether or not under the new guidelines they're followed to the extent individuals do get sent to prison, or whether or not they get suspended sentences. So really it's watch this space and see how things play out over the next few years. That's my presentation.
Any particular quick question or clarification on or ask of Rod from what we're going through?
Yeah, can I just, I mean, on the first iteration of the Act itself, one of the words that kept on appearing was, was the control in mind of the organisation. I mean, is that still something that you look for, is to actually get the person at the top of the tree and try and prosecute them rather than the corporate organisation? Because I remember doing a lot of risk management sort of work, and in that was always about the control in mind.
Yeah, so that was under the old Corporate Manslaughter Act, wasn't it, where it was called the identification principle. You couldn't prosecute for corporate manslaughter unless you were able to prosecute a senior individual for gross negative manslaughter or failings in that regard. That's now been removed.
Okay.
Corporate manslaughter, you can prosecute the corporate entity in their own right without having to prosecute any individual. But that doesn't mean there's not still liability for individuals. There's still gross negligence manslaughter, and there is still individual liability under the Health and Safety at Work Act. And in fact, the number of directors and senior managers that are being prosecuted, the latest stats that have come out doubled in terms of the number of convictions as against the previous few years. So there is very much still a focus on individual culpability and liability going forwards.
Okay, thank you. Next up, Joe from Bizra is also on our committee of the CIBSE FM group and lead chair of the CIBSE Guide. I don't think any of you in the room that are involved in buildings and maintenance would put your hand up and say you've got more than enough budget that you need. So Joe's going to give us a view on an update on the business-focused approach for maintenance, where recommendations where you should be looking to spend your money, and certainly with that thought-provoking start from Rod, what money you do have, where it's best placed to maintain the building.
Okay, thank you very much, Geoff. Yeah, I'm glad I'm not an operating FM. Right, so business-focused maintenance is a strategy to help you. So, as Geoff said, it's all about you staying within your budget. What you need to do is meet the needs of your organisation. You have to keep looking at these UK energy efficiency targets. That's still within your gift to give, and actually complying with the legislation lands firmly on your doorstep. So why do we maintain at all? Mostly it's to stay out of trouble and stop these buildings falling down and killing people. But there's also this safe and efficient. So the focus could be on efficient as well as it can be on safe. We are trying to minimise unforeseen failures. So no surprises, people don't like surprises. And we're also trying to maximise operating life because we don't have the budget to replace anymore. And then we've got our statutory obligations. So how can we do that effectively? Well, hold on, we need to prevent things from happening first. So in pictures, so what we do with maintenance is try and prevent these sort of things from occurring. So the top picture on the right is an air pocket thing. I can't get the words out. So somebody has dismantled that during maintenance and left it exposed. So it will corrode and fail. So in our maintenance, we can prevent this sort of thing from happening. And then energy efficiency as well. And the whole point is to stay out of jail. So the business-focused maintenance is about you revisiting what you do on maintenance tasks. So currently there's a bit of a push from the industry saying we'll do SFG 20, but they are generic tasks with generic frequencies that don't take into consideration your business needs. So what we're saying in business-focused maintenance is you need to consider that stuff. It's also not taking into consideration that you could have a 40-year-old boiler compared to a last year's boiler model. And it's not taking into the fact that technology has now changed, and we need to think about those when we do our maintenance tasks. And it's also not focused on the fact that you actually have limited resources. And what we need to do is find a way of utilising those resources to the most effect. And the way you do that is you look at the consequences and the likelihood of failure. So what you want to do when you consider business focused maintenance is what does the organisation need, and from those, so let's take an example of a chilled water pump. So how likely is that chilled water pump going to fail? And there are a whole bunch of ways of assessing that. It's condition, whether or not you've got reliability in the system, whether you've got N+1, and also the consequences. So what happens if that fails? What happens to the business? What happens to the environment? What happens to health and safety? And you need to be in a safe place for your organisation within the budget that you've got. So you don't want to be up in this red zone where there's high consequence and a high likelihood of fail. So if you put that all into operational context, you've got to think about what does the system provide for my organisation? How does it relate to the business that I'm trying to support? What interactions are there between systems? We've got valves, gas valves that will shut off if the fire alarm system shuts off. And we need to understand those interactions. How do they play out? How systems work? What sort of resilience is there? How hard are you using that system? Is it doing its maximum work, or is it only doing its minimum amount of work? And then think about the resources, the cost that you're going to incur if these resources fail, and what any future plans the organisation has. There are too many examples where you have done a 6-monthly visit on a chiller at vast sums of money, and then the business says, actually, I'm moving out next week, and you've wasted all that money. So you need to think about what the business needs as well. So the other problem we've got is that businesses are all different. So we need to think about what is important to each business. And I can't tell you this bit because they are all different. So when you think about consequences, what could they be? Health and safety is right up there. And as you use this methodology, which is what business focused maintenance is, you will never get a health and safety impact scoring less than do maintenance. So there are occasions where you won't do maintenance, but anything with a health and safety consequence, the scoring system won't let you get to a point where you won't maintain. Also, environmental impacts. You know, they're high on some people's agenda. If you've got a laboratory system with nasty gases around, and you could contaminate the area, then that would be high impact, a high consequence, and a high interest to your organisation. But other businesses, they'll be more worried about money and downtime and time to repair. So if you're a data centre, the last thing you want to do is have downtime or interruption. So you'll put your consequences of that, they'll be the highest. And then lots of people are worrying about money. So how much money have I got? How much money will I lose from this failure? And then sometimes some organisations are focused more on what does it look like to fail and have consequences. What will the media say about me if I have this impact? You know, if you're having a fire alarm system in a hospital and you're chucking them out every 6 months and the media get hold of it, what sort of impact is that going to make on your business? So you need to think about all sorts of scenarios, and they're all different for every organisation. So what happens is there is a guide. Demonstrate. There is a guide. So this will give you 6 steps of how to conduct a business-focused maintenance assessment. So you're looking at your organisation and how the assets that you maintain support your organisation. And eventually, when you do the business consequence versus the likelihood of failure, you will come up with a number between 1 and 100. It's as simple as that, and what it is it gives you the language to talk to people. So finances and those that control your budget won't understand what well, this fire alarm system failed and 4 times and they're telling me it's unreliable and I can't get the spares. They don't care about any of that. You give them a number that says you are at risk, 90% risk of this system failing, a red flag, then they'll invest some money. So it's changing the language that you're using as well. So essentially, you use a score to determine the level of maintenance that you would carry out on a asset. So you can see you've got basic stuff from 1 to 10. Anything that's health and safety related will not score less than a 10. But when you do have assets less than a 10, you would think about not maintaining, because actually the cost and the consequence eliminate that risk for you. And then you get right up into the red zone where actually you are at high risk and you need to be thinking about strategies for reducing that risk, not just maintaining but maybe designing out risk at this point. So undertaking the exercise gives you some sort of insight into your maintenance as well and your assets that you're maintaining. What you do with the score, you know, it will never come out the same for 2 different properties. So I can't sit here and say, okay, I'll do a risk assessment or I'll do a business focused maintenance sample on this office block and the one next door, and it will both come out the same. It needs to be site specific and business specific. So in this example, you've got loss of heating in a hospital. Actually, the consequences are pretty high if you start turning off heaters at this time of year in a hospital environment. So the 90 score will take you into increasing maintenance and maybe condition monitoring, so that you are improving your ability to prevent failure. But if you put the same system with the same boilers in an office building where actually they could put jumpers on, you could get temporary heaters in, you probably wouldn't maintain it at the same level. And that's where you get your differentiator and where you can focus your resources. So one thing that has happened, you know, business focused maintenance has actually been around for 10 years. We've been talking about it for that long. And one of the things I always tell people is it's not a one-step exercise. You don't do it and run away. You've got to continue to review what happens. So if you get rid of maintenance for any assets and that low grade, then stick them on a plant room tour. People are walking around a building all the time. If you take off the toilet extract fan, because it's, you know, the effort you put in and the resources you put into maintaining it cost more than actually repairing and the consequence, then put it in a tour and people can pick up early signs of failure. So you don't have to let it fail, but you can stop maintaining it. And then just implement new technologies, so we're getting much better at being able to pick up failure modes. In the new guide we've published component life failures. So what that is because this was a research project initially 5 years ago, what we're saying is these are the things that you've got in your system, the components, so boilers, safety valves, etc. And this is the most common cause of that asset type failing, and this is how you might maintain it and prevent it. And what you've got to do is use technology to help you, because we have moved on. So when you've done all that, what I need you to do, if you implement this system, is keep monitoring your reactive calls. So if things start failing more often, because you are not maintaining it, because you've decided that it's not a big risk to the organisation, then you've got to revisit that. So you need to be documenting what's failing, why it's failing, what the consequences are, and then you can pull it back and prevent that from failing again. So it's about monitoring, documenting, and understanding the changing needs of your business. So no business is static, we're changing all the time. So if you do undertake the business focused maintenance review, it's about making sure you continue to review your processes. So there are benefits to business focused maintenance. We increase the plant availability because we're not taking them out for maintenance activities. We increase reliability because we know when they're going to fail, we're looking. There's less disruption because we're not taking them out. We have channeled resources. I had a horrible event where I went to a university to talk about business-focused maintenance, and the resource planner said, don't worry, we haven't got a lot of resource, but what I did was I took out our emergency lighting tests, and we don't do that anymore, and that's got much more, we've got more sort of resource available. It's kind of like a light bulb moment saying, but what risk have you put the students and your business at? So, you know, we need to get away from those scenarios. We need to give them something that, a process where they can evaluate those things. So we're improving our resources. We're also telling them that actually visiting this critical chilled water pump every 3 months, because I've assessed that it's critical to the organisation, we're giving them purpose. You know, if you go and visit a pump every 3 months, it's just another pump. If you tell them it's a critical pump for the system, then they might actually pay a bit more attention. So, you know, you're making sure that they know that there's value for the work that they're doing. So, and ultimately, there is a cost saving for this. I haven't met anybody yet who can't save money by undertaking business-focused maintenance. I did do a benchmark exercise with somebody, and I've done it twice now. One was a site where the site went off and did the business-focused maintenance under some support, and another one which was desktop. And both of them came up with around about 30% savings on resource time. And that's because there are assets out there that we visit far too often. With the technology that's changing, with the consequence of that asset failing, they're all things that don't actually make that much difference. So in this example, we had VAV systems and fan coil units being visited quarterly. The impact was so low on the business that they moved those off to annual. So they'll still be looking at them, but they won't maintain them until an annual service. Then pumps, you know, if that pump is sealed, which is more often the case these days, what actually can you do to maintain it? So we're moving those from quarterlies up to annuals. Control panels, very static things. You do your annual survey with a thermal imaging camera, and actually that's probably all you need to do to pick up any failures that are coming, and improving, reducing time. So if you go to a control panel and do every screw to see if it's tight, that's a few hours. If you use a thermal imaging, it's 5 seconds, 10 seconds. So we're reducing time in that way. So there are savings to be had, and I would encourage you all to at least read the guidance, think about consequences to your organisation of asset failure, and thank you very much.
A question for Jo before she sits down.
That was a bit of a whistle tour. Sorry about that.
She'll be available to talk afterwards. Okay, thank you. Finally, the next session is, as I said, Jo led the rewrite of CIBSE Guide M. Myself, a number of others, and 2 Steves who will be up next, will lead the authors in a number of areas. And as part of that, and again aligning with the compliance some of the points we've heard tonight, I know the Steves were quite passionate actually. You say there's always debate about competence and how do we comply. What is there about it? So from that, there's been a proposal, and they've led on putting together a sort of a competency guide in what we at CIBSE call a knowledge series. So it's not a thick guide, there's one on building services maintenance, just probably about 30 pages, 20 pages, that sort of thing. So they're going to update you on where they've got to it and will be published in the future. So I'll hand over to the Steves. Yeah. We're looking to one another.
And it's super like from him. Right, okay. Right, is there a key to move it on?
Yeah.
Okay. Right, so I'm going to start just by
telling you why I'm competent to stand here and talk to you. So coming back to what competency is, there we go. So I've been around for probably about 25 years. I know, I don't look it. I've been in commercial, retail, education, government, various sectors. I started off in design consultancy, how to put these things together, and then I moved into looking at how I maintained them, and then through the life cycle and renewal phase as well. So I've worked through the whole area, underpinned by an education, fairly broad-based degree level, covering various systems. And from the attitudinal side of things, yeah, absolutely, I'm committed to trying to make the building services industry better. We're not great in some areas, and this is one which, as Geoff said, I am quite passionate about, and I guess with Steve's support, I've pushed this to try and make something, because it's very misunderstood. So what we've done is put together a proposal for the CIBSE editorial committee to produce a knowledge series document. And what it's intended to do is to set out what competency is, first of all, how you acquire it, how you assess it, develop it, maintain it, and manage it. And any one of those steps, if you don't deal with it properly and you lose it, then you put your business and yourself, as we touched on in the very first presentation, at risk of potentially a criminal prosecution, depending on your role in the organisation. So it looks at risk and proportionality, your liability. It also then touches on a number of processes and systems which have dependencies, so HR recruitment, talent acquisition, and of course training and continuing professional development, which is very key to us as members. We all have an obligation. And we also touch upon competency management systems and what benefits these bring to organisations, particularly if you've got a robust one, it can really help you. So what is competency? That's why we're trying to put this guide together. It's got many, many meanings depending on who you talk to. It's one of the most widely used and abused terms in management legislation, standards and organisational literature. You won't find one definition, you'll find multiple definitions, all with various slants depending on the industry or the sector that's written them. So that confusion has really driven the need for this guidance. And why? Because more and more regulation, standards, acts, they all require individuals to be competent, but it doesn't tell you what you need to be competent. So it's a very, very grey area that you'll only know that you're not competent when actually it's too late, and potentially you're there trying to argue why you shouldn't have a custodial sentence or have a fine. So why isn't it more clearly defined? Probably because of that misuse and abuse across all those sectors. There's one definition there which I put, I'm not going to read it, but it's one that CIBSE does support, and it's out of the UK spec. And I particularly like this because it not only talks about the attributes of competence, but it also refers to initial professional development, which leads nicely into what we as professionals have to do in terms of continuous professional development. One of the reasons I guess we're here tonight, just to try and educate ourselves. So a little bit about the liabilities of a competent person. Now, particularly in safety-related systems, you will see or hear, particularly in MOD environments and that sort of area, phrases like authorised engineer, appointed person, approved persons, competent persons. These are all titles. These are all out of MOD. It's their structure for the management of safe systems of work, and it's a methodology which they employ to help protect them and their people against claims of lack of competency. So what do those appointments mean, or what do they infer? They infer that that person has specific roles and specific responsibilities which are over and above the common man, the normal person. As a result of that appointment and that inferred competence, they attract a higher level of responsibility. They're more culpable if something goes wrong. They probably take a few extra pennies as well. You can rely on that person's experience and their expertise. They are a go-to person in relation to that particular system, and arguably, if legally challenged, the competent person would attract a greater liability, would have more of a weight of the courts or the system thrown at that individual because they are deemed to be competent. They would be looked on as if they would, shall we say, be more responsible than the normal person. And then we get into this issue around claims about negligence, which I'm not going to touch on now because competence and negligence is a very interesting dynamic in itself. So I'm now going to hand over to my colleague who's going to talk you through competency management systems and the need for CPD.
I'm not used to these microphones, so with my voice I don't need microphones. Thanks, Stephen. It's a good introduction as we've gone through on competencies, moving on to competency management systems. I'd just like to start by introducing myself in the same manner as which Stephen did. I started my career about 30 years ago in the Merchant Navy with BP. I qualified with a master's degree in Building Services Engineering, and I've recently qualified with a diploma in Occupational Safety and Health, and I've worked with the colleagues at Clyde Co a few times in the past. I've had various roles through my working career, and all the time it's synonymous with engineering. You are competent, you work with competent people, and you deal with competent systems. We all do, it's part of our job. And I've done all the way through my career and my systems. And I'm quite passionate with the belief that competency reduces injuries, and as such, reduces liabilities on the bigger picture and the way things will work with regards to the systems Rod described earlier. Onto the slide, competency management system. This is a process of setting up arrangements for managing and monitoring your competency of your structure, your organisation, the risks within your organisation, and the skill levels and training needs of the people you've got within that, your key assets. It's a framework in the organisation where you can demonstrate that you manage and you understand your risks and you employ competent people. And there's a couple of questions we've got there on the bottom, and it's part of the key development. So quickly moving on with the next section. Within the knowledge series we've done, Steve and I, we bounced ideas off each other, we've built it as how it's supposed to go, and actually the system is currently within most organisations and most needs. Depending on the level of organisation you're with, you'll either be managing it through a series of spreadsheets with names, competencies that you'd assume is associated with their trade, all the way up to larger organisations where you'll be using integrated processes through your HR system, through your engineer system, and through your training system. The key thing is they need to join together for them to be verifiable when you, if at any stage you need to bring them forward as evidence. We've listed the 5 stages of providing a CMS, and that's to establish the fact that you really need one and define the requirements and the parameters that the CMS is supposed to work to. You do that by assessing your business, you do that by assessing your risks and the level of people you need. From that, you will design your system. You will understand the type of people you need, and you'll go out to the market and you'll be employing them. When you've employed them, you'll be implementing the systems. There'll be processes in place, procedures to follow, and set forms and documentation to go. As you've gone through that, you maintain and you develop the competency level, and that will be part of a training, development plan, as it's mentioned before, letting your senior people come to conferences like this and learning on modern technology. largest organisations will employ people and they'll have them audits, they'll have gap analysis, they'll be doing regular HR competency reviews, and they'll be looking at it, improving their system, improving their competency, and identifying risks that they are currently not managing within their business, or they've got a competency deficiency. Again, I mentioned back the process that you've got, which you'll be using within your systems, will very much follow your HR line. And that strings out from within the document of the knowledge review, is the knowledge series, is that from the point of employment, when you decide, I need to start looking for people to employ, that's when your competency system starts to kick in. You set your risk assessment around the job you go, you will then define the job description. The job description will cover your risks. You will then look for the person to match the job description. You will sit down and you will employ him. As part of that employment, you'll have looked at his CV and determined his skills and knowledge. You'll have sat at the interview and assessed his aptitude and his understanding with regards to the works by asking him questions. And you'll go through that and you'll get yourself a comfort feeling that he's fine and he matches the job. Or, I've got a guy here, he's brilliant, he's 80%, and I need to do the following for the 20%. And you'll do that as part of the process. Subcontractor control and performance management, they're also part of it. Again, they're procedures within a major organisation. Change management, when businesses when large service businesses decide to move from an industry of retail, as we mentioned before, and perhaps go into prison service, all of a sudden they've hit a new market, but they haven't changed their competencies. They'll still employ the same people. Simply re-evaluate what you do. Near missing accident data, it's part of their health and safety. You can identify competency limitations by analysing your data. Disciplinary and capability processes, again, you can do it and you can use that. Review and quality management checks. They're all systems within large organisations and the small organisations. They're all systems within that. We've put up a quadrant diagram, and it's a series of questions, simple questions that you can ask yourself. As an organisation, do we have a robust employment policy? Do we recruit the right person for the task and associated with the job description? Are the persons who have been historically within your business being evaluated for the jobs that they've changed to? Do we monitor and identify gaps and put training plans in place? Do we employ competent subcontractors to do defined tasks? We employ processes including competency for our appraisals, and we continuously review. And again, within the middle is the extract of the definition which Stephen put up on an earlier slide, which is the knowledge and understanding, the skills and the aptitude. Have these four things moving around when you're sitting at the job description stage, the interview stage, and the job offer stage. It should form part of the construction for employing people. And as a last slide, Geoff has asked us to give you some homework for going home. And he said earlier on that we were keen and enthusiastic. I've still got the wrist burns and the damaged shoulder when he twisted our arms to get in to do this. So, on your own tonight, ask yourself a simple question. Am I competent in the role which I provide for the organisation? And can we prove it? And it's the last bit that's usually the hardest part. Because I think there's lots of competent people, but if you actually got asked and went down the avenue which Rod described earlier on, and you have to stand in front of a prosecution, and the prosecution's got a person on the opposite side saying, are you really competent? And he starts asking you lots of questions. It's good to be able to fall back on the company's quality systems and processes, not just on your ability and your competence, but to fall back and let the company turn around and say, he's competent, he followed my systems, and we deemed him so. So, series of questions, and thank you.
Well, I think all three sessions, thought-provoking, the hard facts at the beginning, Joe's approach to prioritising maintenance, and now this is their competency work, which I think is very, very good. It'll be interesting when CIBSE put that out, what sort of reception it gets. So just for the next few minutes, I'd like to throw it over to you for questions from anybody on any of the sessions, or any views, any prompts, any thoughts. I'd start off by saying, from what we've heard tonight, particularly in Rod's area, the people think, or does the panel think that it's actually going to help people justify budgets to make improvements on good maintenance around the compliance areas? Have you got a view, Joe, or Steve?
Yes, definitely good. I mean, you start talking about those sums of money and demonstrating those to your organisations. You know, go back from the seminar, take the slides, show them what sort of fines they will incur if you don't have the budget to maintain, and see where it gets you.
If I add on to Joe mentioned the Joe mentioned the business focused maintenance. I implemented it for a customer when I was working on it, on the business focused maintenance for the client. We reduced the annual PPM by 60,000 work orders going out over a series of business, and the purpose was to try and save £500,000 worth of saving. The client came back 18 months afterwards once it managed to balance it, and it was £1 million on it. So going from their original maintenance process that they were going through. So you said that you've got things. I actually went through and we put it through.
We need a case.
I couldn't get them to give me the figures.
Question.
It does work.
A question about competency. Do you see this down the line in a few years' time, once your guide has been published, as becoming part of an assessment of contractors and subcontractors?
No.
Because it's a bone of contention. There are people who are trying to do the thing right, and we've got people who are properly trained and equipped and following the right guides and doing business focused maintenance, and then there's a bunch of people outside who don't, and I don't see clients assessing or reviewing the difference before contractors start as to the calibre of people. I accept it's a difficult thing, but it's a logical extension surely of by defining.
There is an excellent guide within the health and safety guidance documentation for the management and employment of contractors and identifying competency. The purpose of the competency that we went through was to explain to people that the parameter of competency is difficult to put into a box, and it's the training and identifying the needs within your business to make sure that, and look back within the business to make sure you've got competent people working with you. So it's not actually to say, this is how you make that person competent, or this is how you audit or review it. It's too big, it's too much of a slippery eel to deal with.
But it's the start of a framework that allows you to do that.
It is.
So
It's
down
exactly
the line, if this thing becomes widespread and implemented, you'd like to think that actually these people use that system, apply it consistently, and therefore have competent people, and these people don't.
Yes, you could go to a competency, you could go to a contract and say, can I review your competency management system?
That's not a question that appears on PQQs at the moment.
No.
There'll be copies of certificates maybe at the pinch.
We go into a little bit within the knowledge series. We go into competency certificates and qualifications and how they don't actually form competency. They're one of the key factors, but it's not actually just because I have a degree doesn't mean I'm competent.
Or applying it.
Yeah. So it does go into that, and I think it's going to cause some discussion when it's because I have a qualification I'm competent, or just because I've been appointed a AP or a CP I'm competent.
I think the other thing to add is I think there's a misunderstanding broadly around the difference between competency and competencies that many organisations have that they use as a tool to manage their staff, particularly at management grades. Competencies are competence, and otherwise that lack of clarity potentially could cause some serious issues because people follow competencies and assess them without really understanding how they're applied.
The risk of hogging things, I've got a question. I'm intrigued to read your leaflet there of case studies.
Yeah.
One of the other interesting factors with this, and it's not new, but it's been amplified in the new guidelines, is the mitigation for an early guilty plea.
Yes.
Which you can't imagine people are going to cop an early guilty plea and move on as people always did, but where otherwise they might have thought we'd stop and fight. When you're talking about 30% off and 30% off is $1.5 million, and say we're guilty and go through the process. Do you see your business being, in terms of arguing defence cases, being less, people being less inclined to pick up the fight, or how do you see that playing?
I think that clearly if there's an argument that can be run, ultimately it'll be the business decision. But if there's a valid argument there, then businesses may well still run that. I think that where there's guilty pleas, but the prosecution are putting their case on the basis that you've got a higher level of culpability than you accept, or the seriousness of the harm risk is higher than you accept, that there might be longer contested sense where more representations are made to the court in that regard. Yes, we accept our culpability, but we don't accept exactly how the prosecution are putting it, and these are the reasons why. And quite how involved that gets, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out, and whether or not evidence is called in that regard, by how accountants might feed into it. The cases we've dealt with so far, it's simply been making representations to the court on the point, and the court then takes the view. So it's not always the case that you might accept your culpability, but you don't accept exactly how the prosecution is putting the case against you. In terms of the sentencing guidelines.
Yeah, just coming back to competencies, something I've got passionate about as well. And coming from an operational maintenance background, I was in the merchant marine myself, and know from what we had to go through in terms of demonstrating our competencies before we were allowed to pick up a spanner and whatever, than anything else. What more do you think CIBSE needs to do to drive the competency up in the operational maintenance sector of building services? And do you think it needs to be driven by a client requesting EngTech engineers, for example?
So that's an interesting question.
Lots of questions.
So requesting EngTech as an example, it's a qualification. A qualification doesn't infer competency. So I think going down that route, yes, it's great for education and it's great for personal development, in as much as people would fund the educational system. But there are multiple routes to competency, and that type of certification and education route is merely one of them. On-the-job training, for example, with somebody with a lower technical qualification that can be supervised and developed, frequently exposed to work types over a number of years, can actually, if I use the phrase the university of life, can actually end up being better in terms of their application of their trade than somebody that has a qualification inferred from a university or a further education establishment. So I guess my view is it's dangerous if CIBSE and BNES and other organisations that have the power to influence the building services market start defining absolutely those ingredients that you have to become competent. I think it will also probably find that we would end up restricting the market, which could have actually a negative impact in young people moving into our industry. So I'm not sure that we really need to infer an absolute route. I think what we've tried to set out in the guidance, and to mimic Steve's comment of earlier, it's not one size fits all. Every different market and industry and business is different, and everybody needs to use the principles that we've inferred in this guidance to apply their own system to their particular business.
We've stolen within the knowledge series. We've stolen a term from another organisation, another series, and it's risk and proportionality. And it's identifying the task that's associated with the work to be done, understanding what the risks are associated with it, and then determine the proportionality that you're prepared to take as an individual, manager, and a company. So, using your analogy with the spanner, you can go through training in the University of Life, and you can go around and you can tighten flanges up, put bolts and motors together, but you need to go to another level of competency if you're going to be told to go out onto the workshop floor and tighten down the cylinder head of a marine diesel, for example. And so for that you might need a HNC or a qualification. Still doesn't mean the person's competent, but he will have gone through a workshop training, and you'll have asked him, you'll do your assessment from there, but it's down to risk and proportionality. One of the best analogies, I think, is the electrical field, where you employ an electrician to deal with standard household electrics, and then you try to employ him because he's become freely available in the electrical industry's short of resource, and you employ him to become a plant room engineer, and it's a different ballgame altogether, different training level. But the fact he's got an electrical qualification, you could be tempted to employ him. That guy you could inherit as part of 2P later on, and you move him to a site that's got HV on site. All of a sudden this guy's an electrician that's got lots of experience, and you want to become the HV guy. You're then putting yourself out at risk, and that's where we're talking about proportionality. And that goes along with training, budget, money, and it's not defining a person by their title, but by their... It's a long way around, but you did ask about 4 questions.
Okay, any other points before we close out?
Yeah, I just think one of the key areas, and having worked a lot, sort of pretty much over most of Europe and whatever,